In the previous tutorial and your hands-on exercise, you were writing string messages to order backlog China and order backlog US. This was to simulate orders coming in for two different regions. We then need to consume messages from each of these topics to determine if the order quantity is available in our inventory. And we've separated these out into two topics because the inventory systems might be different in those two regions. So let's get started on consuming asynchronously, first from the order backlog China topic. We're going to use the async runner again. So here I have the inventory checker china.java file. You'll find that in the additional file, so please move that over to your dev training folder. And you'll see that inventory checker China extends async runner just as before. So we're going to be responsible for implementing the setup and the work loop just as we had to do in the previous example. But now we're going to be consuming messages. So we will need to create a consumer completable future that we need to pass around inside of our application. And we're going to need to set the name of our subscription to the order backlog China. So we're going to be reading from this topic, but we still do need a subscription name. We are also going to, after reading and deciding what to do with that message, we're going to write to another topic. So we do need the producer factory as well, and that's going to be included in part of the work that we do. So our work loop is mostly empty, but it's going to be our responsibility to take the consumer completable future, receive a message asynchronously, handle that message, and then acknowledge the message asynchronously and send the completable future from the acknowledgement back through the work loop back into the async runner. So the do work loop can continue. The handle message method I'm mostly giving to you here. This is going to take the message, and if it contains the value to somewhere in the message, it's going to send it over to the order declined topic. And notice that this is on a tenant that you will need to possibly change based on your student number. If it does not contain the value 2, we're going to send it over to order approved. So this is to simulate, say, hey, we're checking the inventory to see if it's available, whether or not we should decline or approve the order. We're just doing a simple comparison to get that to work. We then use the dynamic producer factory as we discussed in the previous challenges and videos by using producer factory.getProducer. And this topic is the topic that we're going to produce to, which is this one here, either order declined or order approved, but we're using the same string. This is not the topic here that we're reading from, which I'm calling topic name. So that's where the consumer will read from. This producer will write to either order declined or order approved. We use a similar then compose with the send async, returning a completable future. But we're going to do a synchronous block. So we're going to, while we're using send async, we block this by calling get, and then we say we published and will acknowledge it. We acknowledge it by returning the completable future. And I'll fix that there. And that will happen here in the work loop. That's part of what we need to set up is the acknowledgement. In the setup, we're responsible for creating the consumer in the first place. So let's start by creating the consumer. At the top here, under to do create consumer completable future that we're going to pass around, I'm going to say completable future of a consumer of a string type, and we'll call that consumer. So we need to initialize that. We also need a subscription name for when we sign up for messages from order backlog China. So that's just a simple string. And I'm going to call that inventory checker. So once we attach to order backlog China, we create a subscription, and then we're signed up for receiving messages. So in our setup, we have to create and register the consumer and then return that completable future as part of the return statement from setup. So to create the consumer, we use the client, which remember was automatically created for us and then passed into setup. So we have access to the client. And I should say consumer equals client dot new consumer, and we have to pass in the schema, and we're still just using a simple string. And I'm going to put these on separate lines for ease of using or readability. We specify the topic that we're going to read from, which is the topic name. Then we say the subscription name. And that we put in as subscription name at the top. Next up, we have another item as we build this, the subscription type. And we're going to use exclusive. And we'll explore different kinds later on in the course. And what else do we need to specify about the subscription? What position do we want to start at? So the first time the consumer connects to the topic, where should it start its cursor? And other times you connect, it will just continue where the cursor left off, but we need to specify where would it start the first time it connects. So subscription initial position, and we're going to say subscription initial position dot earliest. And then subscription, we're going to create the subscription. We're going to say subscribe async. And that's going to return the completable future back to this consumer here. So based on that, we then need to register that. And I'm not going to go into this, but this is a little bit different way of doing it because this is a member method. But we're going to say then accept. But we're going to say this register resource. And then that's the completable future, because that's also asynchronous, that we're going to return from the setup statement. So once that completable future has completed, we're allowed to go ahead and start the work loop. So if I head on over to the work loop, and we have access to the consumer. So the consumer completable future. So the first thing I'm going to do is take that consumer completable future and unwrap it and get access to the consumer using then compose. So I will have access to the consumer here inside of this. And what do I want to execute on that consumer? Well, I want to first get a message from the consumer. So I do consumer.receive async. Once I have the message, so this is a completable future. Once I have that completable future, I'm going to pass that into handle message. So as you can see, handle message takes a completable future. And using then apply async, it unwraps it and allows us to then start processing the message. It will also return a completable future, as you can see here. So once handle message completes, I can use then compose. Again, these are all asynchronous methods that come with Java. I use then compose to unwrap it and use the message object again to say consumer.acknowledge async from the message object. That acknowledge async returns a completable future. I return that from my then compose, and then I return that completable future back through the work loop. And I'm missing one semicolon here. So this is the way that we would use the work loop to take the consumer, unwrap it so that you can do a receive async, pass that into handle message, which will unwrap the completable future using then apply async. We return another completable future, which will then go to then compose, which will call acknowledge async, which will eventually return us back out of the work loop. Within the work loop, we do create a completable future for the producer factory, but we call get to actually block it. So the send async won't finish until that send async has actually finished sending that message either to order declined or order approved. So I've already tested this out earlier, but if I go down to my terminal, and again, in the developer training folder, the Maven command here is inventory checker China. And I'm going to copy that and paste that. And this should compile, and we'll see if there's any messages ready for processing. Again, this is going to be reading from order backlog China. You may want to start producing messages in order backlog China again, if you don't see anything here. To do that, let's create a second bash. So let's say a new terminal. In this new one, we should change to the developer training folder just as before. I will produce messages by going to order producer, and let's copy the order producer command. And let's wait till we see that this starts producing messages, and then we'll go back to the other terminal and see if it is starting to read them as well. I am running right here my order producer, and as you can see, any of them that say like 49 US are going over to order backlog US, and those that are saying like 50 China, for instance, those publish to order backlog China. I also have inventory checker China running. So if I go over here, you can see that it's reading messages out of the order backlog China topic, and only those that were published to that, which are the ones that contain the word China, are being read. And then some of those are getting published to order approved, while others are getting published to order declined. And right now we're just basing that on if it contains a value of 2. But in fact, you would go check your inventory system and see if the order is valid, if that item is available. And then it would go over to the next topic, and then we would decide what to do from there.